Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well.
Good.
Ready and raring to go.
That's
here.
Right. Always.
We're going to be talking a little bit about Central America, but it's more specifically about Venezuela. But there's somebody from the administration, I think his name is Pompeo, has an important position. He's been traveling down there, spread goodwill, spread diplomacy, visit our good neighbor. This might be part of the good neighbor policy, and down there visiting. But things haven't gone too well, for him. I don't think it's gone well for the American people, and I don't think it's gone very well for America's image. But he went down there and said a few things, but there was a Chinese official responded because Pompeo, he was blaming China for all the problems. Our policies are absolutely perfect. We're the exceptional nation. All we want to do is help people. And so this Chinese official came in his declaration about what Pompeo was doing. Has Pompeo lost his mind? Which is, I don't think he's lost his mind, but he's lost his demeanor, and he's lost any diplomatic skill if he ever had any. And the whole thing is we go down, and even though he visited several countries, his whole pitch was it's somebody else's fault. China, for instance, in Venezuela, it's their fault. They're in there and they're taking over, but they don't have any military troops. They don't have plans for it, but they spend money down there, and they're interested in expanding oil. They have actually even offered and have spent. Matter of fact, they've loaned them a lot of money to try to improve their grid, which has been terrible under their government. But China happens to have, a better understanding of how the markets work and how you can transition away from a very, very, authoritarian communist system over into a market system. And China's had some success. I mean, there are bankers. And so instead of us looking at what we're doing because of the way China sees it, we're down there putting on sanctions and telling them what to do and threatening them and trying to provoke naval incidents. So I think it's pretty bold for our leadership to go down there and blame it all on China. Not that China is an angel, there's no doubt about that. But right now, if you didn't know any names, U.S. or China, and you just described what country A is doing and country B is going, well, that sounds like a good idea, investing, so trying to be very objective, our policies there, as far as I'm concerned, are deeply flawed.
Yeah, it turns logic on its head because here's Pompeo. China is doing trade and investment with Venezuela. They have for a long time. They've had a long relationship. They're doing trade and investment, and we're trying to overthrow the government. And somehow the Chinese are the ones that are horrible and terrible for trade and investment. We should be the U.S., we should be the capitalist nation. We should be trading and investing. That is the good thing. And so here he's blaming China for going down there and investing, as you say, helping them with the electric grid. There's a lot of suspicion that we actually helped blow up that grid a couple of weeks ago to try to get that regime change going. So here they're fixing things, we're blowing up things. The message is clear. You better line up behind our foreign policy or, buddy, you're going to have some trouble,
I wonder if the president had a little bit of concern about how things were going because he sought out Jimmy Carter. The story in the paper was that he called Jimmy Carter and evidently talked to him, I think, on a Sunday, and President Carter was at church, but Carter then reported a little bit, about the conversation. And this is interesting because President Carter said, I think you're right. China is a problem, and they're getting way ahead of us, and we need to be careful, and we need to change policy. He said, what we need is less antagonism, and we don't need to be spending so much on military. He says China doesn't spend hardly anything compared to us on the military, and we're spending all this money, and then we use this military, and then we throw our weight around. And he said, they have money in the bank and they're investing down there. So he says they are getting ahead of us. I think it was a cool statement because he acknowledged that. At the same time, though, he was able to diplomatically say, Mr. President, you can't solve this by just throwing more military weight around, because there's going to be a limit to that, and it's not the way to win friends. So I thought Carter's interview was pretty interesting.
It is interesting, and Carter should know better than anyone what the neocons are like. Their idea of foreign policy is just the Deus Vult, just the will. Strength of will is enough for policy, and that doesn't work, and it's never worked. They've always been wrong. And actually, I'm surprised because I read a tremendous article in the Washington Post, of all papers, yesterday, written by a gentleman called Francisco Toro. And he's all in favor of regime change in Venezuela. He hates the government. He's not on the other side of that. But he wrote a piece called Pompeo Reaches Dead End of Trump's Venezuela Policy. And I'll make a few comments about it as we go, but it starts out by painting the scene of here's Pompeo on the Colombian side of the border with Venezuela. And he's shouting out, as Toro points it out, he did an odd thing. He publicly addressed a private Venezuelan citizen, demanding that he do things that only a president can do. Because we've de-recognized Maduro. He's not the president in U.S. eyes. He's just a private citizen. But here's Pompeo on the border saying, "Mr. Maduro, open these bridges, open these borders. You can do this today." So which is it? Is he a private citizen or is he the president? So it's just it's amazing. There's more to it we can talk about, but the neocons convinced Trump that this is going to be a cakewalk. We'll get this over. You'll be the hero. We'll have our guy in there. Everything's going to be great. But there was no plan B, as Toro pointed out.
But we have to have something to blame, and the whole thing is blame China, and of course there's a little bit of blame game going on with Russia as well. But President Carter pointed out, he said, since 1979, we normalized diplomatic relations when Carter was in office. In 1979, as the Cold War was winding down and things were improving. Matter of fact, I was in office in '79, and I remember there was a big event that there was some diplomacy, and some Chinese communist officials came, and we were sort of fascinated with that. But President Carter pointed out that since that time, China hasn't had a war. They have border disputes and they have their problem, but they haven't gotten into a hard war. But he also pointed out, to support his thesis, that maybe we should spend our money differently, rather than just saying we need more military spending. He said, which is a statistic that's been around. He said, of the 242 years of our history, we've been at war all those years except for 16.
Oh, geez.
Only 16 years. So I think is enough. And they'll say, well, we've gotten along pretty good. Our empire keeps growing, but maybe the empire's growth will end. And maybe someday there will be a few people get annoyed with us deciding that we're destined to run the world.
It's true, and maybe it'll end in a little country called Venezuela. But the Toro makes another good point, and it goes along with what you were saying. He points out that for hundreds of years, the standard diplomatic practice is to recognize governments on the basis of fact, not on the basis of what you wish to be true. So the U.S. recognized China, as you point out, as the government of China. We recognize the USSR government, even though we didn't like it, and we're actively seeking to change that government. So the idea is that you recognize who actually controls the country, not who you wish to control the country. And the neocons convinced Trump, I believe, to throw this practice, this hundreds of years of diplomatic practice aside, and just have the power of will. We want Guaido to be president, and so he is, and it's a disaster.
Well, this comment I'm going to make is a little bit away from Central America, but it's been in the news about Pompeo. And Pompeo is right now dismissing, and our government is dismissing any effort from Kim to start the negotiations again. And the president said he's my best friend, so to speak. He plays that role. At the same time, the official answer is, you promised you'd get rid of those nukes, which that promise had some exceptions to. Anyway, you didn't do it. You got to get rid of those nukes, and then we're going to talk to you. And once again, the person that came onto the scene for this, the individual representing the group, I think, should be dealing with 99% of this, and that's Moon from South Korea.
Yeah.
And he was elected to get along with North Korea, and the North Koreans, I think they've made some significant steps. It seems like we're the more determined and the less flexible, and say, do it our way or else. So I just think if Moon and Kim could get together, and of course, South Korea has to pay attention to what our roles are. They're in a binding, but they've also served the purpose of maybe helping to move in the direction that Trump has gone in. So all is not lost, but it's still pretty messy, especially when you hear from Pompeo what he thinks, about why they're not having this next round of talks.
Pompeo and Bolton are determined to up the conflict everywhere we are. And in fact, if we take that same theme and go back to Venezuela, we've got a tweet up here. This was a remarkable exchange. This is a Washington Post journalist. Pompeo did his tour of South and Central America, or South America, and he was in Peru. And here's a Washington Post writer. He asked a question of the foreign minister of Peru. Are you concerned that these sanctions, U.S. sanctions against Maduro, might be negatively impacting the humanitarian situation in Venezuela? Something that's pretty obvious that's doing. And Pompeo jumped in between the two of them and said, you shouldn't ask questions like that. And he accused him of blaming this whole thing on the U.S. So it's amazing to think of a U.S. Secretary of State berating a journalist, telling him what kinds of questions he's allowed to ask and what kinds he can't. It sounds to me like he's feeling the heat of some pretty boneheaded policies.
Of course, sort of is symbolic of the condition that exists, why we have such concern for how Assange is going to be treated.
Yeah.
He let it out of the cat out of the bag about exactly the way they feel about people who ask questions.
Yeah.
So that is a shame. Also Russia and Pompeo and our foreign policy is still in the news now. Just recently. NATO, which is very, very aggressive, decided they wanted to cancel out any relationships and talking with Russia, which they have been doing over military affairs and civil affairs, and it was mainly something where you can release some difficulties and energy and let it talk out. But we just terminated that, and there just seems to be a movement. If there isn't a problem, let's create a problem. And they talk about a military buildup. I don't believe it's going to happen in Venezuela, but it's all part of, it has to be all part of the threat. But once again, we do things that I consider, warlike, if not close to practicing war. Because in Venezuela, we worry about the children,
Yeah.
So we put on tariffs and sanctions, and we want to stir up more trouble. And lo and behold, who suffers first when we put on sanctions? All we have to do, it isn't as bad as it was in Iraq, because it was really terrible there. But in a way, this is the same type of policy, and it doesn't help the victims of their children, and yet probably the issue is oil and a few other things, oil and empire, and where we stand with our empire.
But you're not allowed to say that. Pompeo said you can't blame us for the misery caused by our sanctions.
I don't want to blame us. I want to blame some
Blame
specific
him.
guys like him
Like
who
him.
have give us bad policy.
Exactly. But we've had this cooperation with Russia since the end of the Cold War, this NATO-Russia cooperation, and it has done a lot to ease tensions up until recently. But they're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I don't know if it's by design or just by happenstance or by their incapability of fomenting a decent policy. But this goes, again, I hate to keep returning to this Toro piece, but I encourage people to read it because it's good. He's talking about how Maduro has always been close to China, Russia, and Iran. They've always had trading, because of he's sort of part of the resistance. And Toro said, while he's always been close with them, he never owed his survival to them. But today he does. So because of our policy, we've put it to the situation where Maduro owes Iran, China, and Russia. His whole survival depends on that relationship. We're pushing them closer together. That's what our policy's done.
Yeah, and you know, each day you hear certain events occurring, but I have to think in my own mind that the conditions are getting worse. There's no advancement. We're on occasion, and still there's a little bit of hope, you know, with Korea. But the truth is how can you expect them to really come up with a decent change in policy when you think of what's going on with in Iran? You know, there's no effort there to really get along. There's a determination to build up our military, and if they don't listen to us, then they're going to have to be disciplined, and we have the military might to do anything we want. But it doesn't lead to the best of conditions for the world.
Indeed. And I guess to answer the question, has Pompeo lost his mind? Yes, he has. So has Bolton, if they've ever had them, and all the neocons. Probably the person who's really lost his mind is Trump for listening to these people, because they're always wrong. But I want to end, and I haven't done this in a couple of days, but remember, through April, the end of April, we are doing our spring fundraising. Help us continue the show, the Ron Paul Institute. We've got a lot of conferences, including in Houston in May. For your donation of $50, we're going to send you this book from Dr. Paul, his latest book, fantastic book on the individual versus the collective. For a donation of $100 or more, Dr. Paul will sign the book. We've gotten a lot of response. I want to thank everyone who has responded. We'll start sending those out in a bit in groups, but please help support us, help support the truth, help support the real news, the Ron Paul Liberty Report, the Ron Paul Institute. Make your donation, ronpaulinstitute.org/support, and we'll get these books out to you, and trust me, you're going to enjoy these books.
Very good. And I would have to say the tune of our report today has been a bit negative because it says that the neocons are still very powerful, very influential, going in the wrong direction. Yet the other day when we did the program immediately after Assange was released, we had a bit of encouragement because we had tremendous response from that. It probably was one of our largest programs ever. And I don't remember reading or seeing any negative comments on this. People were very pleased with this, which means there's a lot of people out there also recognizing that messages have to be spread. But we have to narrow it down to a philosophic principle that everybody can understand. And to me, it's really, reasonable diplomacy versus interventionism, versus the idea that America is exceptional and we're great and we have the moral authority and responsibility to throw in our weight around and tell other people what to do. And there's a big difference between the two. We can be very strong and we can defend ourselves. At the same time, we don't have to assume that we can go any place in the world, anytime we please, and just print money. You know, if you don't get that factor in there, you wonder how can anybody get away with it? And it's going to last. The welfare state and the warfare state is going to last as long as people say, well, America is great. They have a great currency. I'll take my dollars. We still use the dollar, but the rules of economics and the rules of common sense tells us that there's a limitation to this, and people ought to be prepared. And then when we have that problem, it has to be the question about, are we going to work for a free society? Because it's the lack of freedom, it's the lack of sound money, it's the lack of free markets that has led us to this. But people aren't going to pay a whole lot of attention, even though there's a lot of worry today. They have to realize what fundamentals are causing this thing. And to me, it's the lack of understanding and the lack of devotion to the principles of liberty, and it is the acceptance of what has been preached in our university, that authoritarianism by the special elite in Washington and elsewhere is what we need. They don't argue, yes, do we need them or we don't need them? No. Oh, we just need improvement. We need better regulations. We need better managers. We need people that know how to regulate guns better than the other people. So no, the real moral principle is, should we live in a free society where an individual should be protected and not depend on the federal government for the protection that we should provide for ourselves? So the job is to understand and promote and spread the message of liberty. want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.